Evening, everyone. Hope you've had a good day. Tonight we continue in Matthew chapter 5, and we are going to be reading from verse 27 to verse 30. And tonight we look at the section simply entitled Adultery. What we looked at on Monday night was how Jesus shows that even in the commandment of do not murder, do not take someone's life, we are guilty of it. And that would be perhaps the commandment that the vast majority in the world would say, well, I'm innocent of that. But what Jesus does is he shows just how guilty we are within our hearts of sin, and thus showing the true meaning of the law was to show us just how sinful we are, and thus point us to a Savior. And what he's also doing is he is showing his disciples and showing the people there what true righteousness looks like. The standard that God would call us to is not just external righteousness, but purity of heart. For we remember in the Beatitudes, he says, blessed are those with a pure heart. And so tonight, as we look at this next section, it's a challenging one because it speaks of a sin that is committed in behind closed doors most often, but it is a sin that almost always occurs within the mind first, and that is the sin of adultery. And so let's read Matthew 5 verse 27. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to be for one part of your body to be thrown into the fire than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body go into hell. This is a challenging passage because it speaks of the sin of adultery, but also the heart behind adultery. And the sin behind adultery, the root behind adultery, is not merely the act of being with a man or a woman who is not your wife or you are not married to them, but it is in fact lust. No man, no woman ever falls into bed with someone who is not their husband or wife without first having committed lust with that person in their hearts. And so lust is the root. Lust is the first seed that gives birth to this absolutely devastating sin of adultery. Within the Old Testament, we see that the punishment for adultery in Leviticus 20 verse 10 is this, that if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And so what we see in Leviticus 20 verse 10 is we see that the command for the punishment for adultery is death for both the man and the woman. Both parties are to be put to death. Now, we'll just keep that in mind for tomorrow as we would look at the next section. But the punishment for adultery was a serious one. This wasn't just a slap on the wrists and don't do it again. This was a death sentence. And so the people would have known this, and in the narrowest interpretation of the law, which was very often the most popular interpretation of the law, it was seen just as, have you been with a man, been with a woman who is not your husband or wife? And if you haven't done that, well, then you're innocent of the sin. But what Jesus goes in and he shows straight away, as he did with murder, and he will do with all the others, is he says, have you committed lust in your heart towards someone else? Now, the problem with lust, the danger with lust, isn't that it is just this something that is just between you and the Lord. But the danger with lust is the subtlety of it and the deceptive nature of it. We live in a world today that many people would say, well, what is wrong with lust? What is wrong with me just lusting after a man, lusting after a woman in my heart? No one is getting hurt by that. But the problem with it is that as we live in this increasingly over-sexualized world, the more we would entertain things in our heart, what happens in the heart comes out of the mouth and comes out of the action in the man. And so no action that we would commit has not first been birthed within our heart. And so for all the sexual immorality, for all the sexual impurity that we are faced with in the world, all of it comes from the heart. And so Jesus goes and he says, if you want to live a sexually pure life, if you want to obey that commandment and be fulfill the beatitude of blessed are the pure in heart, then we are to kill the sin of adultery at its source, and that is lust within the heart. Ephesians 5 verse 3 says this, do not let there be even a hint of sexual immorality among you. Do not let there be even a hint of sexual immorality among you. And so this is the standard that we as Christians are to pursue. Not even let there be a hint. So when the moment of lust would come, we aren't to sit there and entertain it for a few moments and then cast it away. But at the moment, we are to cast it away and not engage in that temptation. This is challenging, particularly in a world that has become, as I've mentioned a minute or so ago, incredibly over-sexualized. This is incredibly challenging in where every advert, every article, almost every website that we would look at would use sex to sell a product. How do we remain pure? How do we hold on to purity in the midst of this? Well, first of all, we look at Job, where Job says these words, that I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look at a woman with sinful intent. And so that is a good covenant for us to make, that we would start off and control our eyes for what we would view as what we would entertain in our hearts. And so straight away, when you would see your eyes drawn to something that you shouldn't be looking at, cast your eyes front, soldier, and do not be drawn there. This requires incredible self-control. This requires us to know what the enemy is and to stand up against it. But added to that, do you see the incredible standard, the incredible thing that Jesus calls us to do from verse 29 onwards in Matthew chapter 5? He says this, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. Now, is he saying that we should cut off our hands and cut out our eyes if they cause us to sin? No, obviously not. That's just a case of hyperbole that Jesus is using here. But he's saying we should be willing to take the extreme measures for purity. We should be willing to go to the extremes to save ourselves from sexual immorality. And so I would ask us this question. Are we living with that mindset? Are we seeking to kill sin to that degree that we are willing to put things in place to cast sin away? Now, just coming back to that, does Jesus mean that we should actually cut off our hands and cut out our eyes? Absolutely not. There would be some extremes that would say, well, yes, maybe that is the answer. But the problem with lust isn't the hand, and the problem with lust isn't the eye. Those are just means for us to act out our lustful thoughts. The problem with lust is the sinful heart that is too easily entertained and too easily drawn away and finding joy outside of the Lord. And so how do we maintain purity? As I mentioned, we cast our eyes away from all that would distract. Seek accountability with someone who could ask you the tough questions about what are you thinking? What are you entertaining in your heart? If you have a problem with pornography, be it on your cell phone, be it on your computer, be it in whatever means it is, seek help. There are great resources available that are accountability sources and also just filters that we can put on to our products that can help us seek purity. Why? Because this is a serious, serious issue. And too often, because it happens behind closed doors, because it is something that just happens in the dark recesses of our hearts, we can overlook it and ignore it. But as Jesus says here, this is the harshest of all of the responses to sin that Jesus would give in all of the Sermon on the Mount. Why is that? Because the effects of sexual sin can so quickly and so easily form a massive hindrance between us and our relationship with the Lord, first and foremostly. But it can also very quickly and very easily come and break down our marriages and causing that devastating effect. No one falls into bed with someone who is not their husband or wife without first having lusted after that person first. And so guard your marriage, guard your wife, guard your husband, guard your future marriage, guard your future husband, guard your future wife, and stay free from this. Seek help if you need, but most of all, turn to the Lord, for He is able to free us from the effects of sin. May you be blessed. May you walk in holiness and pursue holiness with the Lord. God bless.